Hi everybody, this is the Congressional Progressive Caucus first time ever Facebook Live Town Hall on a specific issue, and the issue is prescription drug pricing. This is one of the biggest issues in the country. I'm Mark Pocan, one of the co-chairs of the Progressive Caucus. I'm joined by Lloyd Doggett from Texas and the other co-chair of the Progressive Caucus, Pramila Jayapal. And we'll all be talking in just a second, but just briefly to open it up, this is an issue that's so important to people. Every town hall I've done in my district, and I just got done doing 6 in my district, this issue comes up. The cost of prescription drugs keep increasing at rates that make payday loan industry CEOs blush. It's so much, and we really need to deal with this as a country. The Democrats ran on this in November. We said we're going to address prescription drug prices as one of the things that's driving the cost of medical care so much. And we're really proud that we have endorsed a bill that Lloyd Doggett has introduced that is the best measure we can do in this country to make sure that we're addressing the cost of prescription drugs. So Lloyd, you want to talk a little bit about your bill?
Sure, Mark, thank you, and I want to welcome all of you, and our colleague Katie Porter from California who's just joining us. We look forward to answering questions that have been coming in as we were a little delayed with votes on the floor. We'll say welcome to our office here in the Capitol, and drawing your attention to the tranquil scene of Texas bluebonnets in the hill country near the district that I represent. Unfortunately, as Mark indicated, the situation for people who, the millions of people who require prescription drugs is not very tranquil. And that's because we have in this country monopolies that have used often taxpayer money to develop drugs. Then they're granted a monopoly by the government, but there's no constraining of those monopolies. How do we get in this situation? I think it is good for us to just think a little bit about the situation that brought us here. And I have been working on prescription drugs for many years, but there came a time about 15 years ago that the Republicans responded by establishing what is now called Part D of Medicare. And that bill came about in the wee hours of the morning, where the voting booth or count on the floor was held open for about 3 hours in the middle of the night as people were threatened and cajoled to support this bill, adopted almost on a party line vote. There were some good features of the bill, but the benefit that pharma got, the big pharma companies got, was one provision in the bill that said Medicare cannot negotiate prices. And that assured that their monopolies were protected. And so what our bill is about is responding to that and saying, first, let's repeal this provision that pharma invested so much in to get millions of dollars in campaign contributions and lobbying. Let's repeal that provision that has generated billions for them. But let's replace it with something, because just negotiating the prices is not enough. What if the pharmaceutical manufacturers won't negotiate, won't willingly give up the billions of dollars of monopoly profits that they've been obtaining and that they're obtaining right now from people all over this country? And our backup is to say, this is an American problem. It doesn't exist in most other countries. Let's use an American solution. And that American solution is competition. You negotiate, and if the drug company won't negotiate in good faith to help people, we're going to license other companies to come in and compete against that monopoly and bring down the prices. And in the meantime, while we're waiting for competition to get in place and the license to take effect, we'll look to what people are paying in other countries and say it's just not right for American consumers to have to pay 2, 3 times, 4 times what people in other countries are paying. So we'll put that in as an interim price, but ultimately we'll rely on American competition to get the job done.
And we negotiate through Medicaid, we negotiate through the VA for drugs. Why not Medicare?
Exactly.
And next, our co-chair of the Progressive Caucus, Pramila Jayapal, also is the author of the Medicare for All bill, and this bill is also a component of the Medicare for All bill. And do you want to talk about why it was such an important bill?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so great to be in your office with your tranquil scene. Next time I'm going to have to bring a 7th District scene in. We're going to have a little competition right here.
For sure.
And to be with my co-chair, Mark Pocan, and also with Katie Porter, incredible new member that is here helping us, I think, at a really critical time. So for me, so many of you that are watching and that are on Facebook Live and have been with me on Facebook Live over and over again have been pushing also for the Medicare for All bill. And it felt incredibly important for us to take this piece of legislation, which we really think is the best legislation that is out there, to ensure that we reduce drug prices, pharmaceutical drug prices, and incorporate it into the Medicare for All bill. It isn't, as Lloyd said, it isn't enough just to think about negotiating, because you can have situations where pharmaceutical drug manufacturers will say, nope, we're not going to negotiate. And if there isn't a stick to go along with it, if you don't have a carrot and a stick, then you end up in this place where these pharmaceutical drug companies can continue to engage in what can only be described as rampant anti-competitive behavior. Price gouging behavior. What does that mean? For all of you that are out there, you probably know people who are skipping their prescriptions. 1 in 5 Americans today skips their prescriptions, life-saving prescriptions in many cases, because they can't afford the price of pharmaceutical drugs. You know that many people are cutting their pills at their kitchen table because they can't afford to go and fill a new prescription. And so this bill, Lloyd Doggett's bill, is really an important step forward for us. It is a commitment that we made in the last election to the people to reduce the price of pharmaceutical drugs, and that is what we intend to do. This bill will allow us to do that, both with the carrot. We would like to negotiate with you, as we do for the VA, for Medicaid, but we need to have something that also allows us to make sure that we get those prices down, and that is the competitive piece of it, allowing for generics to be licensed if a brand name pharmaceutical manufacturer won't negotiate on that price.
Exactly.
So we're thrilled to have it in the Medicare for All bill. It is a really key component. We anticipate it would bring the cost of pharmaceutical drugs down substantially, and we're very committed to moving it forward.
And if I didn't mention, this bill has been endorsed by the Congressional Progressive Caucus as the piece of legislation we would like to see move forward. There are other ideas out there that would be half, quarter, eighth, 16th, maybe 32nd measures, things that have ideas like arbitration and limited numbers of drugs. But when you talked about people cutting their pills, we found out my mom was one of those people.
Right.
That was cutting pills because she couldn't afford that, and we had to convince her why that wasn't good for her health to do. So this happens in so many families. Now,
I was just going to add like that. In my part of Texas, diabetes is such a major problem, and you see people that are reducing their insulin, trying to extend it out, and sometimes it has horrible consequences. Those are the people that may eventually face an amputation, add so much to cost, not to mention the tremendous limitation on them and their families. But we can do something about this.
Yeah. And we were really fortunate too, because one of the newest members of Congress and newest members of the Progressive Caucus is someone who isn't new to advocating on behalf of consumers, because she's done it pretty much all her life in California. Someone who has an excellent reputation within our caucus and financial services. And I think you had one of the most viral videos recently where you handed a CEO at a bank, I believe, his derriere. And I think I could say it that way.
That's a very polite way. That's just for Facebook.
My mom might be watching. So anyway, our good friend Katie Porter from California.
Yeah, thank you all for having me, and really these are 3 of the mentors that I have in Congress, and so the chance to be here with you and talk about this bill is really important. And I think one of the things as a freshman member is this was the #1 issue that I heard about on the campaign trail. I represent Central Orange County, California. It's a district that's historically been Republican, and this is not a partisan issue. So this was an issue that I heard from independent voters, Democratic voters, Republican voters, frequent voters, infrequent voters, people who weren't even registered to vote. But when we talked about the importance of reducing prescription drug prices, we brought the entire community into the conversation. So this is an incredibly important issue, and we see that also in the polling. So recent polling from Social Security work shows that over 3 in 4 Americans, again from across party lines, support letting Medicare negotiate drug prices. I have spent my whole career studying capitalism. I am committed to making sure that we have capitalism that works, but inherent in healthy capitalism is competition, and that's what we're lacking because of this restriction on Medicare negotiating. So we see from 2006 to 2015, our largest drug companies earned profits of between 15 to 20%. At that same time, they were increasing the prescription prices by double for most of their common drugs. So we want these companies to have the resources to invest in innovation. We want them to develop new drugs. We want them to be leaders in the science community and to create life-saving treatments. But they need to offer those life-saving treatments that they create to the American people at a fair price. So the reason I love this bill so much is I think it's a bill that really reflects the best of our American commitment to competition, the best of our American commitment to treating consumers right in the marketplace. And the lack of price transparency around pharmaceuticals is a really serious problem. So I'm thrilled to be supporting this bill, and I will really just be a champion for it.
I just want to say something about the profits, because you mentioned profits, and the top pharmaceutical companies took home $75 billion in profits, and that would be fine if everybody were getting the medication that they needed, but that's not happening. And so I think looking at, especially many of those drugs were also developed with our government money, right? That's where the early R&D came from. So I think this bill sort of gets us finally to that place where we can start to see reasonable drug prices. If people are watching and you want to send us your stories on Facebook, that would be really great. Just hit the comment section. We sometimes use those stories when we're talking about this on the floor or giving speeches about it elsewhere. So it would be great to just have your comments as we're going along, just so that we can really keep the pulse of what's happening for you and bring your voice into the debate.
And Pramila, if I could just pick up on your last point, because one of these that we just got while we were voting is from Kathy in Houston. And she asked about this whole question about taxpayer money going into the development of drugs that you were referring to. I was thinking also as we were talking, all of us, probably many of our viewers, we participate in walks, runs, dinners, breakfast, every kind of fundraising for the groups that are out there advocating for the many serious diseases that plague our population. And so often you're trying to find money for the cure. Well, what the data shows is that every newly approved drug, 210 newly approved drugs from 2010 to 2016 relied on taxpayer funding. Took that money that is often raised at these charity events, combined it with taxpayer money, and then once the pharmaceutical company gets it, they have a monopoly. And we tried with President Trump, just after he got here, all of us who were here, just before you arrived, Katie, we petitioned him to use the power under existing law to protect taxpayers' rights and to at least have a hearing to review what could be done to put some restraint. If taxpayer money goes in, that we have a right to get drugs at a fairer price. We never got any response. He's talked about this at the Rose Garden. He's done a few tweets, but nothing meaningful to bring down the price of drugs. So Kathy, thank you for contacting us. It is a key issue that there ought to be some control over those who rely on taxpayer dollars. It's really taxpayer rights is an issue.
So we did get some questions, and outside, I'm just going to read some of these questions,
yeah.
and I think they asked us if we could do 1-minute answers, so we can try to get to as many as possible. But since we were promoting this, a few people did reach out. So we had someone ask, how do other countries regulate medication prices? Are you examining any of them? Can they be used for a model for us to use? Pramila, you want to?
Yeah, so other countries do not give away the power to negotiate with these pharmaceutical companies. They look at that very carefully, and they come up with their prices based on a whole series of factors, from effectiveness of the drugs, alternative therapies, et cetera, et cetera. And so they very much preserve the power to set those prices. They don't just say to the drug company, okay, you go ahead and decide what is the right price. And so this bill, Lloyd Doggett's bill, looks at the best practices in all of these other countries, and it actually brings those in and makes sure that we are doing something very similar.
Great. Fred from San Antonio, so we're going to shoot this to you. Lloyd, I have heard that Big Pharma donates so much to campaigns of legislators that legislators do not pass laws favorable to Big Pharma, or unfavorable to Big Pharma, particularly on cancer medicine. Likewise, there are experimental drugs that are offering the promise of a cure, but legislators won't give the okay to try them. I don't know what to believe anymore, and I'd like to shed some light on this problem.
Well, thanks. You know, I mentioned the history going back 15 years to how pharma got this provision into the bill that we need to remove. Well, the sponsor of the bill on the House floor that night found a great job being the executive director of pharma, and that's what he did for the next several years. Of course, pharma hasn't stopped with him. Drug makers spent over $281 million lobbying the federal government just last year. That's a pretty good chunk of change. It's more than the insurance companies, the oil and gas companies, or any other industry was spent by pharma, and I can tell you they've been really generous this year. They are big contributors to campaigns, to so many members of Congress, and they don't discriminate between Republicans and Democrats, though Republicans tend to get most of their money. So we have a lot to overcome from the power of pharma. Pharma was so strong that when the Affordable Care Act, as important as it is, was adopted, pharma basically got a pass, and that's why we need to act now. People will continue paying outrageous prices. In fact, one person I talked to recently kind of summed it up. What is the limit on how much pharma will charge? In a word, shame, and they don't have much.
Yeah, and just to add to that, that money that is spent lobbying is money that ideally these pharmaceutical companies would be putting into research and development. So the dollars that they're spending trying to persuade us not to fight for the American people, which isn't working with us, that's money that they really should be investing into research and development, or returning to their shareholders, or returning to their workers, and so that's really lost money. And I think one of the things about the freshman class is that we were elected kind of in having watched the power of pharma over the years, and having seen why would we have some of these laws. And so I think I don't take corporate PAC money, other people do, and I don't think it means that people aren't making good choices, but I do think we're concerned about the way that pharma is shaping laws, and what we should be doing is what's right for the American people, which is what your bill does.
It's really why it was so important to get reinforcements here and to get some new perspectives. Yeah. I'm just noting as well, though, since you got here, right now, there are 1,449 lobbyists registered for pharmaceutical manufacturers. So they've got,
it's like
about 301?
And let's be clear, those pharmaceutical manufacturers and the insurance companies are the same ones that are pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into fighting Medicare for all, which has this provision, this bill incorporated in it, because it's a very profitable system for those who are profiting from it, but it doesn't work for people who are dying from it.
$281 million in a year. That's almost as much as Donald Trump used to lose on his taxes. It's a lot of money. So
do you know that?
So next one, we have a question. Carolee from Texas. Do you feel that the government should remove tax incentives for drug promotion activities?
Yes, this is a great question, and I think one of the things, we had an earlier question about what happens in other countries, what's effective around the world, and what can we learn from them. So there's only one other country in the world that allows for those TV ads and the glossy newspaper ads and magazine ads. Half the time I watch those ads and I don't know what disease that drug treats. I'm not a licensed physician. I have no ability to decide if that drug is right for me. And so I think it makes a lot of sense to really ask us, what is the purpose of those ads? They're not being marketed for people who are able to interpret, is this the right drug for me? What are the side effects with other medications that I might be taking? And so it's appropriate for drug companies to make their products information available to to prescribers, to physicians, to healthcare providers. But that money aimed at the American consumer is really designed to stimulate an artificial economy and drive up the use of drugs. And the saddest example of this, and the most powerful example of this, is of course the opioid crisis, where we know that the marketing and aggressive tactics being used to market opioids was a huge factor in the early wave of overprescribing, and has left us with a really tragic situation in this country. So I do think, again, the focus should be trying to figure out how we can use the tax system and other tools to get pharmaceutical companies to invest in that life-saving research. And so every dollar they put into advertising is a dollar they're not putting into research. And I think that's what we should be concerned about. So I'm interested in exploring ways that we can reduce the tax write-off for advertising and increase the tax write-off for research and development.
And speaking of the advertising, the fact that I can pronounce this word tells me I've seen the commercial. I take Xarelto, not a word I learned when I was a kid, which is fairly expensive, but my cardiologist is sold on it for my symptoms. The manufacturer uses a third party to administer a price reduction program when the customer meets certain criteria. Why doesn't the manufacturer just reduce its price for the drug instead of creating this extra layer of administration? Why won't manufacturers like Xarelto use their side program as an excuse against claims of high costs and therefore claim they are not part of the problem but part of the solution?
No, thank you for that question. So a couple things. First of all, I think we have seen that we can't just rely on the pharmaceutical companies to set the right price. What we are seeing is price gouging unless we, the government, gets involved in that. The second thing is I'm really glad you're getting that medication to the person who wrote that question. That is really, really important. But I just want to caution you that these programs are, they're a bit of a fluffy thing, because what these manufacturers do is they set the price really high of the drug. Then they have a charity program, which I bet you didn't know this, but it is tax deductible, so they get a tax benefit for it. And then they also get the brand loyalty of people who desperately need these drugs, like you, for people to say, oh, this company is doing a really good job. When from the beginning, if we were able to negotiate the prices and we had competition as sort of our stick, right, like is in Lloyd's bill, then you would have the price set low from the very beginning, and you wouldn't need a charitable program. You would actually have drugs at the price where people can afford it. So it's a bit of a scam, unfortunately. I'm sorry to say that, but it's a bit of a scam, and we need to look very closely at these programs and hopefully eliminate them by putting in place a real solution like Lloyd Doggett's bill.
And just to add, Congressman Jayapal, they create a lot of consumer confusion. So the fact that we're getting so many questions about what does this drug actually cost?
Right.
Who's actually making money along the way to my getting or you're getting the life-saving treatment that you need? That's not the kind of marketplace we want. Consumers and doctors need to know what does this drug actually cost, and then be able to talk with patients and make the best choice for patient care based on correct, clear, accurate pricing information. Right. And these programs obscure that.
Right. And if you think about how much money gets spent on lobbying Congress members and marketing, right? It is that is all the money that Katie was talking about that could go elsewhere. I had a question though on competition and the capitalist market, because typically if you invested money into something early on, if you were the angel investor for a project, wouldn't you get the results of that back? Wouldn't you get like some sort of a special deal? You know what I'm talking about here. The government is investing.
Right, no,
The
this is
taxpayers
all
of America
right,
that are investing here.
Right.
It's, yeah.
We're getting a bum deal.
And I think that's one of the great myths, is this idea that but for the pharmaceutical companies, we wouldn't have some of these innovations. And to be clear, I've seen this in my own district. There's a role for private corporations to help take these drugs to market. But the basic science research that is creating the groundbreaking discoveries is being done by our tax dollars.
Yeah.
And we deserve to be treated fairly in the marketplace for the very drugs that we help create. So.
Yes, and you know, really, as far as innovation, all of us want to encourage innovation. We want to solve the problems of these dread diseases before a loved one contracts one of them. But monopolies are not known for their innovative spirit in any field of the economy.
Right.
And I think there are many areas that we're not getting the development of new drugs because there basically is a monopoly here, and they're very innovative at extending their patents, but they're not very innovative at providing the answers that so many people need.
And Lloyd, there is a question on monopolies that came from someone, and they got some specifics, so let me try to read this.
Sure.
When I first started taking the orphan drug Xyrem in 2012, it cost less than $3,000 a month. Then a big corporation called Jazz Pharmaceuticals bought the drug and jacked up the price to over $14,000 a month. My husband owns the company that provides our health insurance, so the full cost of the drug is ultimately paid by our family. That's more than $168,000 a year. According to the FDA website, the Orphan Drug Act allows drug companies a virtual monopoly if the company is not expected to recover the cost of developing and marketing a specialty drug. Jazz Pharmaceutical posted record sales of $1.7 billion last year. My question is, at what point does a highly profitable, lucrative drug lose its protected monopoly status so that other companies can make and sell generic versions at a more affordable price?
Well, the answer is really, in some cases, almost never. Because they extend with a practice called evergreening, making slight changes in the nature of the capsule, in the size, in the dosage, in the delivery system, and they can extend this patent protection 10, 20, 30 years. So it is a real problem. It is also, the Orphan Drug Act needs some review. There's some problems with it. The Orphan Drug Act, as the name suggests, tends to deal with problems that aren't being dealt with by others. It's a very specialized thing. It is usually a bit more expensive, but not that much more expensive, and not seeing more than a tripling of the monthly price in order to solve this. The other issue that this question I'd want to focus on too is that it provides for the cost of developing the drug. Those costs tend to be very unknown, very vague, very inflated in the studies that I've seen. Part of the transparency that you were talking about earlier is let's get that data out there, because I think what we'll find is that seeing the cost of a drug go from $3,000 to $14,000 has absolutely nothing to do with the cost of its development. Right. It is the price put on exploitation and on price gouging.
Yeah. So this is one for Katie, since you are our legal consumer expert. Forrest asked, why isn't the Attorney General going after drug companies for antitrust law violations and racketeering?
So I think part of this is an overlay between federal and state law, and this is largely because of the role of the FDA and our patent system. This is an area of federal law, and to be frank, we've seen less than the necessary level of antitrust enforcement in this country across the board, not just in pharmaceuticals, but in a lot of industries. So I do think there is a role for antitrust enforcement, but that is an expensive back-end solution, and what we should be trying to do is solve this problem going forward. So it's to pass this bill, it's to begin allowing drug companies and the government to negotiate these prices. And by the way, we're talking about Medicare price negotiation, but this will also play out in the private health insurance market.
That's a really important point.
Just because you may not be on Medicare yet, not that I'm gesturing at certain people in this room, just because you're not on Medicare yet doesn't mean that this price negotiation won't really benefit you and your family.
Right.
And so when we start bringing more transparency and more price competition to the drug market, that will also help those with private health insurance. And so I do think there's a role for antitrust enforcement, but that's part of why this bill, I think, is so well designed. Come to the table, negotiate, do what we do between a buyer and a seller, which is we negotiate the price, and if we can't get there and there's a disagreement, recognizing that this is not a consumer good that people can do without. This is a life-saving drug that people need to have. We have that backstop of the competitive licensing process in order to make sure that no one goes without the pharmaceuticals that they need to save their lives. So I think it's a terrific question, but I think that recognizing that this is an antitrust issue, and that inherently the only people who benefit from monopolies are monopolists.
So I've got two final questions. We appreciate people watching. The next one, and this is for anyone, let's open these up. Even generic prescription drugs have become quite pricey. Something I can't pronounce. Thank you. Has been around for years.
You have children who have earaches. You know all
okay, all right.
erythromycin. You've just outed yourself as
Thank
a
you.
non-parent.
Yes. Well, I also, you looked at me when you said Medicare, and I'm going to be 55 this year. I recently got a senior discount at a fast food place, and you know what? I was really happy. I saved 65 cents. So anyway, back to the question. Erythromycin has been around for years, and yet a friend says her insurance is paying $700 a month for it. Is there a kickback between insurance and pharma?
I'll just take this one head on. I think the answer is yes. And I think one of the troubling things is we don't understand where those kickbacks and rubs and incentives are, and I think that's part of our job and oversight. So part of the reason I'm excited to start having these hearings and digging into this is to better understand. There are so many players between you, your doctor, and your pharmacist. And those players all have a different financial incentive, from pharmacy benefit managers to private health insurance companies, to drug distributors, to manufacturers. And so I think this complex web without transparency is a big part of the problem. One of the things that Congress did is Congress lifted the rule. There used to be a law in this country that prohibited a pharmacist from telling you that it would be cheaper to pay for the drug out of pocket than to use your insurance. And to this day, pharmacists don't have to tell you that it would be cheaper to pay out of pocket than to pay with insurance. I think that says something about our private insurance system that we need to be really questioning, to your point about Medicare for All, but it also says something about the lack of price transparency. I can't think anywhere else that I go to buy a product that I cannot ascertain the price other than in the healthcare system, and particularly around pharmaceuticals.
Thank you for the plug for Medicare for All, because I was going to say that, if we had Medicare for All, when we have Medicare for All, we wouldn't be negotiating with different systems. We would have one system, and of course that gives us a lot more purchasing power, a lot more negotiating power. And I think in the end, if you look at generics and if you look at that chain that you're talking about, every single one of the pricing decisions along that chain increases the price everywhere else along the chain. And so this is really important. We tried to pass some transparency bills when I was in the state senate in Washington state, and we were not able to do it because they do not want you to see how much these things cost at the different levels, because then you would see how cheap something is, right? Whether it's your EpiPen or whether it's your erythromycin. See, I know how to say that because I've had kids.
All right, so I have one last question. This is for everyone, and we'll start with Pramila and just go right down the line. Given the power of pharma, what do you think we need to do to combat their influence? But more importantly, how do we get to 218 votes, which is the majority of votes you need to pass a bill in Congress to pass the Lloyd Doggett bill? So
yeah. Well, so I started the day doing a Facebook Live with Credo on Medicare for All, and now I'm ending it doing it on this, and it's the same answer. We will never have the money power that these lobbyists have. We will always have the people power that the lobbyists, and the pharma companies and the insurance companies don't have. And so it really is about telling your stories, getting the personal story out there about what is happening. It's about the phone calls and the door knocks and the petitions that you as individuals can undertake and make happen. And that is ultimately what members of Congress listen to as well, because you're the voters. So you elect us, you give us the power to be here, which means you have the power to take somebody away. And so the looking at who has already signed on to Lloyd's bill, checking to see if your Congress member is signed on to it, and then if they are, thank them. Call them and say thank you. Thank you for being courageous. If they're not, then tell them why they should be. And if we have enough people doing that, we will get to 218.
And I want to underline and star exactly what you're saying, because we know that we got 124 co-sponsors. We have a majority of the Democratic caucus, and the only reason we have that, and I know people have come up to you and said, I had 3 people at my town hall last weekend, and they said, why aren't you on this bill? So I want to sign up. Or I've been getting a lot of mail. I've been getting posts on my Facebook at the office from people asking me to join this bill, so that's why I've joined it. It is so important on those 124. Many of them are under immense pressure. Right. They may have a pharmaceutical manufacturer nearby who says this is a jobs issue, raising all kind of phony questions. We've got some alternative proposals out there that I think are not very good. You reference one of them that won't get the job done. We need people to be thanked and encouraged to stay on the bill.
That's right.
But 124 is not 218. And the only way we're going to get there is if we have more people asking more questions, the kind of questions we've gotten tonight of their member of Congress. And so you can go now to the link that is being provided along with the comments in this live feed, and you can see, is your member one of the 124, or is your member not on the bill yet? And if they're not on the bill yet, we need you to talk to them, to encourage them to join this, because that's the only way we can get this legislation passed.
All right, let me, I'm sorry, I'm being handed something to look at the same time, but we're going to end on where we're ending because it's actually an ending. But I want to add the fact that Lloyd mentioned the nearly $300 million in the last year, the lobbying from this effort. The fact that there's 3 lobbyists for every member of the House and the Senate tells you how much we're fighting. And I think really it's what we've done in other areas by having the work we did around the Affordable Care Act when they tried to take away our health care. When people got active and went to town halls and contacted their representatives and make sure that they're going to support a bill that, just like Medicaid and the Veterans Affairs Department, that you negotiate for prescription drug prices. It's that simple. It's not a half measure. It's not about arbitration. It's not about a limited number of drugs, because a lot of people take a lot of different drugs. It is about being able to negotiate for drug prices with Medicare, just like we do with Medicaid and the VA, and that's what would make most sense. So just use your voices, like I know you do if you're watching this, especially if you watched it this far. You probably already have contacted your member, but then put this on your Facebook page.
What are you saying?
Tweet
We're
it out.
very entertaining.
Yeah.
Come
But
on.
I also just want to make a plug for not being discouraged if you're out there and your member, isn't a Democrat, or this is going to come from the pressure that the American people are going to bring. So talk to your friends, educate yourself about why this bill is the best bill out there. Continue to ask the good questions that you've asked today, because this is going to be about engagement and about political pressure and about moving this forward. And it's the chances that the pharmaceutical lobby comes to the Hill and says we're really excited about reducing our profits to a competitive, fair level. Sadly, that's not going to happen. This is going to become because we have the courage to do what's right, to help our constituents, to help families, and to help patients.
And I know all of us want to hear more of those stories, because the stories we're hearing like those tonight, if you forward them to any of us, we will be able to use those, as well as to learn your experience. I talked to Congressmember Jones, and that person gave me this excuse. We want to hear those kind of stories from people in order to be able to get this passed, and I think we can get it done.
Yeah. Well, thank you everybody for spending this much time with us. We appreciate it.
We do have one bit random question.
Well, I'm not sure if I know the answer. They asked where can I get the Monopoly board?
That's the final question.
This is a question I just want to say from one of my amazing constituents in Irvine.
That's right. Well,
Kathy in Irvine, apparently,
Monopoly can
yes.
be fun, but this Monopoly board, it's fun only if you're a pharmaceutical manufacturer and people lose. We're saying let's say no to monopoly pricing, but price spikes and pharma myths, tax breaks, medical mountains of bills, a patent thicket, all the kind of things that allow pharma to extort huge prices, anything that the sick and dying will pay for relief. You can go to our website and you can just print one off. We have no patent or copyright, and we love for you to spread the word across the country, because ending monopoly prices is what this event has been all about and what our effort is all about.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.